Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 64 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So at this point, this episode will really just, wrap up all the loose ends, resolve everything, tie it up with a nice little bow. Dr. Knox here has, decided to drop by and visit Colonel Mustang, who, as we all know, is currently blind. And I'd imagine he's adjusting somewhat, but, not as well as somebody who doesn't have as much going on as he does might. So it would seem as though Dr. Knox is bringing something that Mustang will probably like, I'd be willing to bet it's Dr. Marco. But, well, that's interesting. Despite being blind, Mustang is preparing. The idea here, I guess, is that he's really studying Ishvalan culture, presumably for when he's in charge of all this politics stuff, just so he can sort of integrate people. It is certainly admirable that he's willing to attempt so thoroughly to bury any and all hatchets here. Well, it is interesting that, despite ostensibly resting, I'd imagine he is still fairly injured. Given that, his hands were impaled? Yeah, well, I'm glad that Mustang is sort of taking things relatively well here. Or at the very least, he's not letting it stop him and that he's willing to study. Even though he obviously can't read books now, people have to read to him. Mustang really is lucky that he has so many good people behind him. Man. It is interesting that everybody is sort of acknowledging everything that had happened, that the Ishvalans really came out in force to help and prevent basically the end of the world. I'm glad that everybody is sort of cognizant of that and willing to work together. So, look at the big brain on me. Dr. Knox brought Dr. Marco with him. Dr. Marco being renowned for his medical alchemy. We already sort of knew he had a Philosopher's Stone. So naturally, Dr. Marco wants to restore Mustang's eyesight, presumably in exchange for some benefit to the Ishvalans. Dr. Knox said, they're already one step ahead, presumably meaning that Dr. Marco was just going to ask Mustang to do what he already intends to. I like how Dr. Marco sort of phrased that, he can't in good conscience speak on the behalf of others, so he's asking as a personal favor. Let me heal you so you can go about and do good. And, it's not like Mustang didn't already intend on doing that. And I guess really just to cement Mustang and his reputation for caring for his underlings, he demands that Marco heal Havoc first, and if there's enough left over for him, great. Otherwise, Havoc is more important with his spine and all that. That really strikes me as a very selfless thing to do. So the plot's thickening a little bit. The Major General went out of her way to save Scar. And she says she did it for his alkahestry initially, but, the plots are continuing to thicken here. Major Miles and Scar are, well, two Ishvalans, so, naturally they could be an asset in mending relations, as it were. So naturally, being religiously minded, Scar feels that perhaps the reason he was saved from death is to take part in this. And that's a pretty darn good way to look at things, Perhaps my life was spared so that I might continue to live and do good. So it's interesting that the Major General feels a little bit of maybe schadenfreude that Mustang is going to have a funny look on his face when it turns out Scar is not only alive, but is going to be working with him. I feel like maybe she's not giving Mustang enough credit here. But I don't know, it would certainly be a surprise if nothing else, considering that Scar was a pretty sizable antagonist for, some 60-odd episodes, give or take? I mean, nevertheless, he's certainly turned over a new leaf now, so you can't really hold it against him too much. So, Alphonse is looking certainly better than he had before, but, he's still not in the condition he was prior to all this, He's still kind of gaunt and thin, and he does have to walk with a cane, but, at least he's not as skeletal as he was before. Something to be said for that at the very least. Now that actually is an interesting point here. Alphonse is asking Edward about his leg, and, he admits to not having maintained it in a little while. That is something. Alphonse has his body back, Edward has an arm back, but despite all of this, Edward is still down a leg here. And, there's probably nothing he can really do about it. He's sort of stuck with the automail, but all things considered, that's probably the best outcome he could have hoped for, really. So just to tie up the Xingyi's loose ends here, it's, I guess, sort of returning to the status quo that Ling and Mei are in opposition here, they were sort of competing for the favors of the Emperor. Seeing as how Ling does have the Philosopher's Stone, that means he wins, and therefore her clan is at risk. But Ling has made it very clear that he intends to be a benevolent king. And therefore, her clan isn't going to have anything to worry about. That's probably more than she could have hoped for. Now that's an interesting perspective, that Ling wanting to protect any and all of his people is greedy. I guess it's a good application of greed, for want of a better term. Greed has its good and bad things, just as all the sins do. There are good aspects to them, but it is the excess of them that makes them bad. It's not greedy to want material possessions to, safeguard your family, I guess, but, wanting to dramatic excess would be bad. Now this has certainly got to be a weird homecoming. Alphonse finally returning in the flesh in a way he hasn't in years. You know, I'm sure that if he's returning now like this certainly isn't the sort of visitor Winry's expecting if the dog's just barking. I think that's a nice little scene, you know, just the idea that Alphonse is saying, hey, that tickles, implying he can feel sensation. And just that, paired with, like, the look of shock on Winry's face. It's interesting how almost there's like a sense of foreboding here that Winry almost doesn't want to open the door to see if what she suspects is true is actually true. I mean, I guess fair enough on her part, you know, if she were to get all excited about this and then open the door and it weren't true, I'd imagine that would be rather crushing. But, you know, lo and behold, Alphonse is flesh once again. You know, this is probably the first time the Elric brothers have arrived back since that whole kerfuffle. And I do notice that Winry doesn't have her earrings, so I'd imagine Ed is still holding on to those since wherever it was, like Fort Briggs, that he held on to them. Oh dear. Man, you know, I've like struck like a glancing blow on my own hand with a hammer before, but never quite like that. I'd imagine that has to hurt. And I can't help but feel bad for Ed, because, you know, he doesn't have a metal hand that he can bash away at without worry, and he doesn't have the alchemy to sort of do it automatically. You know, I'm glad to see that he thinks it's worth it to be all flesh and blood, mostly. So it's not quite clear how much time has passed, but Alphonse certainly seems to be more able-bodied now. You know, it's nice that everything has sort of retained its idyllic nature, despite everything. So it would seem as though, I believe his name is General Grumman here. He was sort of made like the interim Führer. And I suppose good on him, I guess. But I don't know, that he's sort of hanging out with Mrs. Bradley, I feel like he might have a bit of an ulterior motive here. Alright, so here we have it, you know. I'm wondering what precisely Mrs. Bradley knows about any of this. Because on the one hand, General Grumman here, he sort of seemed to have talked about Bradley as though he were actually a good man here. And Selim is clearly not what he once was. Like, he seems to be younger than he was before. So I guess, at the very least, Mrs. Bradley seems to know something about his true nature. I mean, it is unfortunate that everybody seems to be sort of like keeping a wary eye on Selim in case he does sort of, I guess, revert to how he was before. I mean, I feel like that's not really something that can happen, seeing as how he's basically just a single soul now, and most everything else was sort of purged out of him. Well, I guess that's that on the politics front. Grummond is the Fuhrer. Mustang's sort of vying to become Fuhrer after him, and he's putting himself in a good position for that. And now we visit the Hughes family. They really are at the heart of this whole thing, in a sad kind of way. It's nice that Alphonse did finally visit them, when that was one of the early things he sort of mentioned wanting to do once he got his body back, visiting them, having the food that Mrs. Hughes cooked. So it's interesting that Alphonse is talking about this new alchemical principle. It's sort of, I don't know what you would call it, like additive exchange, because it's not equivalent, you are adding to it. It's interesting, I'm not sure what sort of outcomes that's going to have in the field of alchemy, but I guess if Alphonse is willing to study and investigate, why not? It might bear some fruit. So it would seem as though Alphonse is going on a bit of an odyssey of his own, going to Xing, learning about alchemy, and he's taking those two chimera with him. It's nice that having his body back has given Alphonse a real zest for life. Or a real lust for life. So there we have it. These guys, they're probably not disgusted with their forms as they are, but they want to be fully human again. So seeing as how Alphonse managed it, sticking around with him might not necessarily be a bad idea. It really is nice how just sort of hopeful the ending is. It's a big world and we want to see everything in existence. So it seems like some things never really change, with Winry sort of nagging at about maintenance and him not really caring. But it would seem as though he has something bigger and more important on his mind. So it's interesting how, almost the suggestion of an appointment rankles. And, this is sort of like playing into the trope about, making a big promise or a big deal of something before you set off on a train journey. I can't help but sympathize with Rinri, come out and say it. And that's sort of like a little quibble I have with this scene. I feel like Ed should have just been a little bit more straightforward with it, but, Can't say I blame him entirely, seeing as how Winry divines his meaning. Well, there we go, you know. Equivalent exchange is nonsensical. I will give you my whole life instead of just half. You know, I think that's reasonably romantic in its own way. You know, I guess some things never change, you know, they do have to quibble a little bit. You know, I do have to say, I really did like this whole sort of subplot. It wasn't really heavy on the romance, but it wasn't something that just sort of came out of nowhere, as is so often the case, where it's like, oh, it's the end of the story. People need to get paired up romantically, you know. I'm glad that there's at least a little something here and there to indicate that this would be the eventuality. Well, you know, despite making that big confession and it ending up being a mutual thing, I find it interesting that they still sort of part ways. You know, I guess, what's the saying? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.